Thank you, everybody, for joining in. I am David Garcia, and I am one of two OER program specialists at the Southern Regional Education Board. We appreciate you being here for our summer Lunch and Learn series on OER and AI. I'm joined by my counterpart, Allison Bailey, and Dr. Ahrash Bissell, who is with the NROC Project in California. Allison and I are joining in from our headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. To give you a brief overview on what we do, SREB is a nonpartisan, nonprofit interstate compact for education. We are the nation's first regional interstate compact board of education, created in 1948 by Southern governors and legislators who recognized the link between education and economic vitality. Our 16 states are Alabama, Arkansas, Delaware, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maryland, Mississippi, North Carolina, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Virginia, and West Virginia. Our work is funded by appropriations from our states, as well as by contracts and grants from foundations from local and state and federal agencies. We basically help states focused on what works in both policy and practice. We conduct research, collect and analyze data, publish reports, and recommend actions on current and emerging issues. Our work on open educational resources is part of a grant from the Hewlett Foundation, which allowed us to establish the National Consortium for Open Educational Resources in partnership with the Midwestern Higher Education Compact, the New England Board of Higher Education, and the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education. Together, we aim to make higher education more accessible through the use of open educational resources. Our summer series webinars are intended to raise awareness of OER work being done throughout the country. So open educational resources are learning, teaching, and research materials in any format and medium that reside in the public domain or are under copyright and have been released under an open license that permit no-cost access, reuse, repurpose, adaptation, and redistribution by others. So with that, I'd like to move on to introducing our guest speaker, Dr. Ahrash Bissell, president of the NROC Project. The NROC Project, formerly known as the National Repository of Online Courses and Monterey Institute for Technology and Education, was founded in 2003. NROC was a pioneer in the development and distribution of open educational resources. NROC Project's mission is to help meet society's need for access to effective, high-quality educational opportunities in an era of rapid economic, social, and personal change. The NROC Project helps educators meet students where they are by outfitting them with the open and low-cost resources they need to effectively personalize instruction. NROC collaborates with educators to imagine represent secondary, post-secondary, and adult education institutions with learner-centered solutions to thorny educational problems. And with that, I'll hand the mic over to Dr. Bissell.
All right, thanks, David. I don't think it was just me. I think you actually froze for a moment, but anyway, we got the gist. Welcome, everybody. There's a relatively small group of us, which really, I guess this is one of the conundrums of doing webinar series, is probably if it had been my position to do so, I would have just seen if you all wanted to hop on camera and say a few words about yourself. I think you can all speak, so or type in the chat. So I guess I would love maybe to start off by just learning a little bit about those of you who are here. And then, we can kind of iterate our way through the rest of this webinar in a way that makes some sense. So I don't know if you have the option to unmute yourselves or if you want to just pop a word or two in the chat. I can see your names. So I can see Leda Cantu Lee, Carrie Gitz, Christy Hill, Maya Smith, Megan Lowe. Would love to learn a little bit more about where you are and kind of what institution you're associated with. All right, we have Christy. from Tarrant County and Fort Worth. Well, we're doing a lot of work in Texas. You may already be aware of that. Let's see, Megan Lowe from Northwestern and Louisiana. Excellent. Another Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. Excellent. And another Louisiana. All right. That is super. And Maya, I don't know if you can hear us. If you want to share. Can wait, see if you put something in the chat or speak up. All right. Well, really delighted to be able to spend really the next hour with you all. I was asked to provide a little bit of almost like a retrospective on the sort of the OER journey as I've observed it and also participated in it, and then how that has sort of led to a lot of the work that I now do at NROC and what we do at NROC as it relates to improving educational outcomes and the intersection with OER. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start things off. Let's see, I don't actually want to, there it is. So you should be seeing a title slide. So again, thanks very much for having me. My name is Ahrash Bissell. I am the president at the NROC Project. I am based in California. NROC is a completely virtual organization. So we have a small, I like to say small but mighty staff of about 22, 23 people, depending on how you count part-timers and contractors that are scattered all over the country. The focus of our organization, as David already shared, has evolved to some extent over the years, but it has always been very, very focused on this idea that technology in particular really changes some of the affordances of education. So, in a society that is rapidly changing, particularly with technical capabilities, what does that mean for education, and how can we orient those changes in a way that actually improves student outcomes, improves student opportunity and lives? We've really kind of zeroed in on this running theme of meeting students where they are and preparing them for what's next. And I'll get into that as this talk proceeds. I do want to encourage you, we will have a reserved Q&A time at the end. So there will be time if there are questions that you just or thoughts that come up that you want to hold on to. I will pause every now and again and see if there are questions along the way, because, this is kind of moving through. There are different chunks of this doc, and it might take a little while for you to sort of hold it on to it all. But I guess I would start by asking, how familiar is everybody who's here with OER, Open Educational Resources, as a construct? And I would say their origin, the logic, like how they're different from just free stuff and that kind of thing. I don't know if people just want to pop into the chat, like, you feel like you're an expert, or you're still learning, or somewhere in between. Excellent. Awesome. So a lot of familiarity. Super. That's great. Okay. So I am going to then really kind of blast through this. Most of this will be pretty well known to you, I think, but it does kind of help set the stage for some of what I consider to be the major issues related to OER today. So you're probably familiar with the fact that the whole concept of open educational resources was really piggybacked on what initially started as a concept around open source licensing for software. That took place in the 80s. That was soon followed by some work by David Wiley and others who are sort of leaders in the field, where it was proposed that a very similar kind of logic model in terms of licensing and what permissions were being granted could be applied to non-software. The origins of that happened to come from the education domain. And so, a lot of the early action around what has now become understood as this sort of some rights reserved model did in fact have its starting frame from the education sector. I'm sure then you're all very familiar that, a lot of this got formalized, codified, not soon after. Soon after in 2001 with the launch of Creative Commons. Creative Commons brought together, a set of leading lawyers and technical experts to devise this schema, this some rights reserved model, a suite of licenses where authors can effectively endow them with permissions to be used that would otherwise be denied by dint of the defaults in copyright law. Things moved pretty quickly after that. UNESCO first coined the term of OER, or Open Educational Resources, really promoting the idea that this was maybe a way for really kind of new capabilities to change things in a positive manner in terms of access, equity, particularly internationally. That same year, the Hewlett Foundation decided to launch what became its open education portfolio. The initial round of funding was scattered. As one of the program officers at the time talked about it, the philosophy at the time was let 1,000 flowers bloom. So they tried to sprinkle the funding about to pursue different kind of aims, different questions that had emerged around this OER concept. How does it work, right? Who should be involved? What are the processes that we need to build or understand in order to support it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I just threw up a few of those inaugural grantees. Some of them have changed names, including ourselves. We were the Monterey Institute for Technology and Education at that time as one of those grantees and have since reincorporated as the NROC Project. The OECD report, Giving Knowledge for Free, I think really kicked things into even higher gear in the sense that it effectively put a stake in the ground saying that this was not just a fad and that, in fact, this looked like it was going to start to move the needle in terms of broadening access and equity, especially globally, and really connected this sort of licensing framework to education in a way that suggested that it was going to hold up, right? That this was something that institutions and particularly governments might want to start thinking about and building resources and programs around it. That was further solidified by what at the time was treated as an attempt to sort of reconcile what were fairly esoteric and academic debates about exactly what defined open, exactly what the purpose of OER might be, et cetera, and led to one of the first of what ended up being several declarations around open education, this first one in Cape Town. And I was there and helped write that. So I'm going to kind of like fast forward now to what's happened since about, say, 2010. I would say that a lot of the early predictions have largely come true. So OER related activities are pretty key and even often the founding premise for many different projects and organizations that are based all over the world. At this point, I would say at least awareness of OER is pretty widespread. There's still a lot of misunderstanding about what exactly OER are or are not from kind of an access legal technical perspective, but there is a broad understanding that there is at least some body of materials, some sort of communities of practice, if you will, where the materials of instruction are intended to be more broadly shared, to be reused, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it will take time to fully incorporate the thinking and understanding about all that into all of our regular practices. But I would say at this point, OER is absolutely an established piece of the education landscape. And indeed, the industry around the production of educational materials has largely had to react and build around that reality. That said, OER as just a part of the infrastructure of education is by no means established. It continues to depend quite heavily on philanthropic as well as specific sort of grant-funded public financing of OER initiatives. For example, the Hewlett Foundation continues to invest quite heavily in the sector. dividing their investments still into these domains of, on the one hand, building out more content, tools, and services, spending some effort trying to think about sustainable systems, and then still just field building, still building up the underlying capacity and understanding across the board. And just, you can go to places like the Hewlett Foundation. There are actually a number of other organizations that have taken the time and the effort to try and compile lists of organizations, projects, what have you, that have some involvement in open educational resources in one form or another. This is a quick sampling of some of the organizations with whom I've had cause to interact over the years. I noted that NCOER, which is David already shared, is a project that's actually a collaboration among 4 of the interstate compacts. Yeah, I would say all of these organizations are continuing to move the needle in some way or another. All right, so I'm just going to move on and share some thoughts about what I see really as kind of what is it that for people who are in education and in particular oriented to all the things that OER can or should be are thinking about today. And these are just my opinions. And I'd be very interested in hearing from the rest of you as this unfolds, perhaps in the Q&A section. So I would say some questions about OER that frankly were present right from inception include these, and this is not intended to be comprehensive, but these are the ones that I found most intriguing. So there is this issue of the legal and technical infrastructure for OER. By and large, on the legal side, that's been resolved around Creative Commons licenses as being the de facto standard. On the technical side, much less clarity. I think people generally agree that if you're given permission to do something legally, it should actually be possible to do that technically. So, giving someone the rights to, I don't know, remix something that implies that you're going to get into the code and mix it up, and then not actually give them the right to do that is a little bit of an odd situation. I would say the field was dominated for years by these concerns about interoperability. This question of, well, how much do people really need to know if you can take this resource and that resource and mix them up and do things with them? And anyway, I'll get back to that in a second. A second big question that I would say is still far from meaningfully resolved are sustainability models. Kind of by definition, the open educational resources are supposed to be free of cost. And so if there is no revenue model you can attach to them directly, how do you do this? And certainly a number of experiments have come and gone over the years, most of which I'd say have not proven to be viable. But so we'll return to that as well. This issue of distribution and discoverability, we kind of came pretty quickly, I would say, to the conclusion that simply putting something on the internet is not the same as making it available to the people who might actually need it. But just where does that, how does that work, right? Like, whose responsibility is it to get the resources into the places that people are looking for such things? And whose responsibility is it to make sure they're sufficiently described, that they're available in usable formats, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This too, I would say, remains a little bit of a conundrum. I think one of the places this has become really cleared up is when there was a shift, at least in my eyes, from the early days of OER, where there was almost a, there was a strong bent away from legacy educational structures like textbooks or, very well-structured lesson plans. And the idea was, we don't need that stuff anymore, right? Now you can make whatever you need whenever you need it. And I think there was this palpable shift where people said, you know what? There's a reason why those things exist, and they're structured that way that transcends the permission to revise or remix. And I think when, for example, Connections rebranded as OpenStax and started publishing full-on expert curated textbooks, that's really when sort of access and awareness and utilization of OER kind of took a big step up. Similarly, with well-designed multimedia that has the adherence to curricular frameworks, respects a lot of what we understand about how people learn, and so on and so forth. And so a number of the consortia that have grown up around the idea that they will be these curation spaces for OER, I think actually are quite instrumental for the continued use and and discovery dynamic. And then finally, impact analytics. If you look at, I would say, the majority of the academic work that's been done around the presumptive value of OER, almost all of it ends up pointing back to cost savings. It's basically, well, it's great if students don't have to pay for stuff that we sort of feel like they shouldn't have to pay for. Certainly in some contexts, such as in community colleges, the cost of textbooks and educational materials always seemed pretty exorbitant, especially given the fee structures, and were certainly a major barrier. But I think there's nothing specifically about OER that is necessary if what you're trying to do is simply give stuff away for free. So at least in the eyes of many involved in the movement, I think there was always an understanding that OER is supposed to be more than free. Like there are permissions, there are capabilities that go beyond the cost. And I think the ability to really model how that's true, right, gather the right evidence, kind of think about what that means in terms of practice, et cetera, has been pretty limited. And so we're still a little behind the curve on demonstrating how those impact metrics really accrue here. So I already kind of answered some of this. I guess as far as revisiting these different concepts, I'd say the legal and technical interoperability, while still relevant, I don't believe that that's really all that important to the continued growth of OER production and usage. Certainly there are cases where interoperability questions, the particulars of the licensing scheme and all that matter. But I would say for the vast majority of how OER are being used, how they're actually having an impact, people are not getting caught up in the particular license that's been applied or whatever it is. That's my opinion. But I think for me, I think that's been a good thing, and that it's kind of allowed things to move forward without getting caught in this continuing fairly esoteric debate about what the right schema is. I would say that we now have a number of organizations, both for-profit and nonprofit, including our own, that are proving that there are models that, I don't know how long one has to exist before you say you've proven it. But, in our case, we've been around for over 2 decades. And that seems like a fairly reasonable position to say that it seems like we've been able to make this work long enough that it is workable, right? That there are other organizations that might build on that knowledge and come up with their own designs that can actually sustain this kind of work. I would say, in my view, as I already relayed, OER-oriented networks, communities of practice, curation sites are critical to the distribution, curation, professional development, and incorporation of OER into institutional practices. The internet's a big, wild, and wily place, and really we just need these places that you feel more assured about what you're looking at and what you're going to get. And I would say there is now starting to be more and more evidence from different quarters about the impact of OER beyond cost savings. Just a few more comments about OER generally. So I think that a continuing issue, and presumably one of the main reasons for things like NCOER and some of the positions that I think some of you have who are here, is that educators and supporting institutions still need guidance on effective engagement with OER. The reality is that so many of the practitioners in our educational institutions, and that's true whether we're talking primary, secondary, post-secondary, adult ed, what have you, don't necessarily have any direct knowledge or professional development around OER and OER practices, the incentives are not always there. And so, you know, continuing to empower people and put them in positions to continue to raise awareness and continue to increase that capacity, I think is going to be key. I think some of the frameworks that have been developed to kind of help people grapple with what it is that's special about OER, including Hilton and Wiley and Co.'s 4 R's of openness, this idea of, you know, this sort of increase in kind of capability, if you will, is pretty helpful, right? It's a way of helping people get at what these benefits are without having to get into all the legal and technical mumbo jumbo. So what I report here, and would be happy to chat more about on this session at some point, is that while the fact of OER has become normalized in the education sector, there's nothing inherently good or effective about OER. In the same way, there's nothing overtly good or effective about a resource that was designed for educational purposes. I think our challenge now as a community is not to simply kind of use the blunt instrument of, you know, OER, we got to use OER, and be far more clear about why, right? What is it that allows us to do, or allows students to do, or, you know, whatever it might be, that at the end of the day actually moves the needle on what this is supposed to be all about, which is, in my opinion, about improving student learning, improving student outcomes. If we're not able to demonstrate that connection in a meaningful way, then it just feels like we're not actually accomplishing what we're supposed to be doing. So I think that as I look around, the most impact seems to be happening in what I'm calling focused but holistic approaches. So fairly focused in the sense of we're producing something or we're targeting a problem that we can define fairly cleanly, so that when there's an impact, we can measure it, we can talk about what impact that has. But we also acknowledge that OER is simply one piece of the puzzle, right? That they're a means to an end. They may be necessary, but are usually not sufficient to accomplish whatever it is we're talking about. You need the associated practices, you need the associated policies, right? You need a variety of other things to get all packaged up. And hopefully there's internal compatibility around whatever it is you're doing, so that you're not having to like navigate through whatever you're trying to accomplish while, you know, battling barriers that you didn't anticipate. So that's my premise. I think you'll see how this line of thinking has really affected the work at NROC, and the way we think about the role of OER in accomplishing our mission. If you're not familiar with it, I would point out that there are a number of other interesting frameworks that have been developed over the years. This is a kind of what we call an OER life cycle. You might call it a collaborative development life cycle that's modeled after the open data and data curation practices. And I'm not going to go through it, but just to let you know that these different frameworks, these ways of thinking about how does one engage with OER to useful ends, can be really great ways of not just educating people who don't know, but also taking a look at your own practices as an institution, right? As a company. We did that using this life cycle, and I'm not going to again go through this, to kind of think through the logic model of what is NROC's role when it comes to putting OER into a space where it is used, it is evaluated based on the data, we can see opportunities for improvement, who does that, et cetera, and then you complete that virtuous cycle. Okay. I am going to pause just a moment and see if anyone wants to pop any questions about that part in the chat, because I'm actually going to move on now and share a bit more about NROC and our history with OER leading to our work today. And as I said, there's time at the end as well. So All right. It looks like more people arrived. It's great. Great to have you. Okay, so let's move on. So NROC, as I said, NROC originally incorporated as the Monterey Institute for Technology and Education. We were incorporated in 2003, and we were one of the original grantees from that Hewlett portfolio around open education. The different organizations, and some of which already existed, like MIT, and some of which really hadn't existed, such as NROC, all had kind of a different place in the portfolio in terms of what it is that the foundation was hoping to learn by dint of making these investments. And at that time, certainly one of the big questions, as I already relayed, was this question around sustainability. While you can certainly give grants to, say, Rice University or MIT or Yale or what have you, and you're like, well, of course, those institutions are going to continue to sustain. Is it possible for OER to become a business, if you will, whether for-profit or nonprofit, of a freestanding organization, an organization that doesn't otherwise have, a big endowment or a primary area of business where their work on OER is simply tacked on, just like any research grant might be tacked on. And so that was one of the charges that accrued to our organization. And so we were given some time to figure this out. I was not part of NROC at that time. I was actually at Creative Commons, but the early days really focused on this idea that there's OER out there already, even though the idea that was fairly newly coined. The thought was the internet's just full of stuff, and surely a lot of it's good. And so there was an emphasis on, let's just go find the good stuff. Then we would bring experts, right, editorial oversight and expertise to evaluate the material, to clean it up if necessary, and then curate it, right, republish it in a way that teachers and educators and professors can actually find it and use it effectively. That original premise turned out to be wrong. There just really wasn't that much good stuff on the internet. And it took way longer to try to clean up what was frankly not very good stuff than it was to simply build stuff from scratch. And so there was a bit of a pivot, and there was a simultaneous effort to identify in a more targeted way published material that people were willing to share, and then redistribute that through a site that we called Hippocampus that we still support today. Hippocampus.org is just an open educational resource distribution site. I'll mention it again in a minute. We also were able to then get funding to build kind of best of breed open educational resources that were intentionally modular, multimedia, and intended to be remixed kind of like Legos. So this wasn't, let's unlock the codex and go in and monkey around with code. This was, no, we're going to give you chunks, just like learning object theory had proposed years and years prior, that make it very easy to mix and match different things and pull them together to create a seamless learning experience. We started with Algebra 1. We eventually got more funding, mostly from the Gates Foundation, to build out the entirety of high school math as a developmental math program. And then we did the same thing for English. Along the way, we ended up realizing that there was something more we wanted to do in order to really kind of target our efforts more effectively, that led us to get funding to build EdReady, and I'll get into that. So where we are today is really scaling. We have a body of tools and resources that we've been able to bring to focus on specific known issues across the education sectors in both secondary and post-secondary. And our job now is to make sure that as many people get the benefit as possible. So as I said, a lot of that early work was in building multimedia courseware. We have these 3 programs. All of them are available as open educational resources. People can take them if they want. You can embed them in your LMSs, and they have that remixable modular kind of construction specifically for that purpose. We also, as I already mentioned, redistribute all of those, as well as open educational resources from a whole variety of partner projects, including things you've probably heard of, FET, Khan Academy, Art of Problem Solving, et cetera. This is a collection of resources that we have the rights or they're already openly licensed to redistribute for free ubiquitously to anybody in the world through Hippocampus, and it covers a whole variety of subject areas. And we continue to maintain that for all the people who use it. And so kind of how then were we able to build a basis for making this work sustainable? Certainly in the early days, much of what was needed in order to kind of stand us up and keep us stable depended on philanthropic support. And so a lot of it came from grants from places like Hewlett, Gates, the Irvine Foundation, et cetera. But we wanted to move towards a model where we didn't require philanthropic support in order to keep the lights on. And so we moved in this direction of building a community, building an institutional membership community. And we asked partners, so various institutions, educational institutions who wanted to work with us, to contribute, to help pay for all of the work. And that required us to make a distinction in terms of who's using the resources. So we made a distinction between individuals. As I say, if you're a person, then everything we do is free and open. You can have at it, do what you want. If you're not a person, so you are an educational institution, you're another company, whatever, we ask you to become part of our partner network and to contribute. In the early days, that was pretty much the only distinction. When we brought EdReady into the mix, it kind of cleaned things up, because EdReady, which I'll describe, is a platform for personalized and adaptive learning that generates data. Those data are data about students, and therefore federal privacy laws preclude us from sharing those data back to whoever might be interested in it. So even if you have a classroom full of students, without some kind of formal agreement authorizing us to share data with, back to the teacher or to the administrators, we can't do it. That is actually impermissible by law. And so that became a more kind of formalized way of saying, yes, you can have all the resources, but if you want to target problems using this platform that does it in a more elegant way, the way we do that is we constitute a partnership, and then that helps us pay the bills. That gives you all the data you want, et cetera. So we had this scheme where we have a blend of options that go from more to less open, depending on whether you're an individual or an institution, and also what it is that you're actually doing with the materials. I don't really need to go into that, but basically it kind of describes why this blend is working for us and allows us to continuously reinvest whatever we're able to get back into making more stuff, improving things, keeping them open, et cetera, et cetera. And that seems to be working. All right, so the bulk of the rest of this webinar until the Q&A is going to focus on EdReady, which is the platform for personalized learning that I already mentioned, is really kind of the heart of what NROC does today. So the starting premise for EdReady was that up until about, I want to say maybe a little less than 10 years ago, we had built lots and lots of resources that I already described. You could get this high quality multimedia, you could do all kinds of things with it. And the assumption was that people would do that they would take the time to customize, to mix and match, to contextualize, et cetera. What we found was that by and large, people weren't doing that. And the primary reason was lack of time. Often it was lack of, confidence or expertise in that. There were a variety of reasons why we wouldn't necessarily see that happen. And what we heard from our partnership community was that they would appreciate if we could somehow make the benefits of these materials easier to obtain. Like, was there some model that we could pursue where it would become a little bit more turnkey to be able to get some of that adaptivity and localization in play? And excuse me, that in our minds, we had already been mulling over a lot of different things. And one of the ways we really kind of brought that all together was we said, at the end of the day, a lot of the power that seems to have been kind of like unlocked with this OER concept is about actually having students have educational experiences that are genuinely relevant to them. And that can be cut in a number of different ways. That can be that it is educationally appropriate, so it's at the right level, it's the right thing for them to be doing, to be building on what they just learned and where they want to go, et cetera. That could also be culturally relevant, making it just that much closer to the things they care about, seeing their own ideas and cultures represented, et cetera. You get the idea. And so we kind of captured that as meeting students where they are. How do we do that? Like, how do we actually make it so that that's what's happening in practice? And that led us into the design of what became EdReady, which is fundamentally a platform for personalized learning that scales. So it's a platform that I like to call an OER friendly platform that you can deploy at various scales, that supports each student individually, but can do it in a cohort model. So you can have everybody in class pursuing the same goals, but the specific paths that each of them take to that goal is going to vary because the platform adjusts according to each of their individual needs. That platform, the EdReady platform, is now the basis for the vast majority of our partnerships. We have, as it says here, over 1,700 institutions that are now using EdReady all across the country and to some degree internationally. And the throughput is very large at this point. You can see that in a few places, notably places like Texas, Montana, North Carolina, so a couple of SREB states for sure, we have even systemic or statewide agreements, which I'll get to. And we see scale as an equity issue. And if that's confusing to you, I'll try to circle back to that as well. So again, EdReady is an adaptive learning platform that's been adopted by district systems and states to personalize math and English instruction and to empower data-driven student success decisions. I'll repeat what I said earlier. We do not purport that EdReady all by itself is like some magic, teaching replacement. It can't and shouldn't replace the human art of teaching. But what you find is if you try to do differentiated instruction in a classroom, or if you try to actually meet each student individually, given enormous variation in where students are without the support of technology, it's very, very hard to do. And so the purpose of the technology is to basically make it so that the aspiration is that much easier to achieve, with the human being able to manage things in a more humane way. Another core principle for us is that every student can benefit from personalized support, whether they're rising to grade level expectations, transitioning to a new grade, preparing for college, or working to earn a credential. So that's every student, meaning we're thinking quite broadly about all the different points in a student's educational journey where the application of this sort of technology, these sorts of principles might matter. It's also the case that we mean every student, in that we don't think of our work as specifically being relevant to, for example, struggling students or students who otherwise lack, privileges that others have. That's critical, of course, but the reality is that so many of our policies, I think, kind of almost hamper themselves when the first thing that you do is segregate students into the students who need attention and the students who don't need attention. And you've just kind of created a weird balkanization effect where a lot of what you're trying to do with the students who need help now starts to feel like charity, or, like they're kind of a problem to be solved, as opposed to just good educational practice is you give every student the best opportunity to succeed. And I'll revisit that in the specific case study on placement that I'm going to go through. And I point out, as I said, EdReady was designed from the get-go to be what we called OER friendly. It was at that time somewhat unusual because the other platforms that were being promoted around personalized learning and adaptivity were really black boxes. There was an awful lot about how they function that was not amenable to, for example, putting in other resource collections or modifying things. They would just kind of break. And so in the case of EdReady, it has this very kind of simple modular structure that fits with the logic of having collections of, for example, OER that you can then decide to include, exclude, organize in the way you want for all kinds of different purposes, depending on what your students are trying to learn. And I think another piece that has been consistently missed by a lot of folks in the OER community is that we actually can't provide these resources, especially at scale, without meeting a raft of other requirements, most of which are imposed by policy. So, for example, when we have a statewide deal, we have to meet certain security guidelines around the protection of data, the authority to access certain systems, et cetera, et cetera. Same with accessibility, same with performance and uptime metrics. These things are expensive. If any of you has been involved in the technology or in the resource production side, there is nothing trivial about making sure that the material of instruction is going to work perfectly well on all the various screen readers that are out there or whatever it might be. But it is critical that we do so. Those laws exist for a reason. And they were hard fought by communities that said, we have to make sure that if we're going to teach using these things, that it doesn't matter who you are as a student, you would have access to it. You can get the benefit of it. Nobody has really yet fully kind of reconciled the fact that those costs accrue to the providers. If the providers are OER producers and they're not making any money, it's a problem. So that's another reason why we've tried to find a model that allows us to make those investments and make these assurances for our partners. All right, I'm going to pause again before I just take a dive on one area in which we're seeing real gains in our work. Are there any questions at this point? Any comments? Feel free to hold on to them. This part will race by and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Okay, well, I'm just going to plow on then. So EdReady, as I already mentioned, is a platform for personalized and adaptive learning. And beyond that, it's kind of wide open in terms of what is the context to which it would be deployed. And so we have EdReady being used in middle schools to accelerate math proficiency, particularly for algebra. We have EdReady in high school, both as a grade-to-grade transition support, also as credit recovery, also for dual credit eligibility, among a number of other things. And then lots of post-secondary and adult usage as a co-requisite support, as an alternative to placement, et cetera. I'm going to focus on this particular, what we call use case, which is using EdReady as an alternative to placement. And I'm going through it because I think a lot of people haven't thought too hard about the way we do placement as a rule in this country and why that's problematic, and how really a mind shift on how to do it, supported by technology, but also significantly influenced by the philosophy of open, right, and OER, can really change the game. So many of you may know that we do have what you might call a readiness challenge. I hesitate to call it a crisis, but it is a very significant problem in this country of just the sheer number of students who complete or have completed at some time in the past their high school schooling, right, their high school education, are seeking to move on to post-secondary studies, but through various policies and procedures are deemed not ready, in effect, just insufficiently prepared to actually succeed in those post-secondary studies. It cuts all across the board, but like so many things, accrues disproportionately to, racial minoritized students, students first generation, students in poverty, that kind of thing. I'm not going to go through this graphic, but these are all, things that have been well researched, very well documented by places such as the Center for the Analysis of Post-Secondary Readiness, the Community College Research Center at Columbia University, et cetera, et cetera. In essence, let's just say about half of the students who, look like they should be pursuing post-secondary studies are deemed unprepared. And if the treatment is to stick them into developmental coursework, which does not confer credit, but costs just as much usually as any typical college course, the treatment doesn't work very well. And for most students, that's not a ticket to success. So we did an analysis where we asked the question, why do we do placement this way? And does it even make any sense? And basically concluded it doesn't. And so I'm going to move through this pretty quickly since we're kind of approaching the end of the hour. When we administer a placement test, so the way there's a lot of ways that this is changing, but let's just go back to the sort of canonical case, which is that a student shows up. Often it's literally that they're showing up to, say, a community college. They're trying to enroll in coursework, but we don't feel we know enough about them to know even which course they might be able to take, if any, given at least credit level courses, given that we don't have the information we want. And so what do? We give them a test. We give them what we call a placement test. Many places still use a widely published placement test called AccuPlacer, which just basically measures their presumptive readiness in the way tests do, which is you take the test and it generates a score. You do that for a bunch of, all the students who are showing up. And of course, you're going to get a distribution of scores. Every one of these students is going to have something different. And if you do that for enough students, it will inevitably result in the typical bell-shaped curve. You're going to have some small number that do really badly, some small number that do really well, and the majority of them are going to do somewhere in between. This is all just facts, right? Like there's nothing mysterious about this at all. Where things get squirrely is you have to now figure out what to do with the score. The score has to mean something. and in the eyes of most institutions, that means you have to define what's called a cut score. There's some place here where we say if a student gets high enough or beyond that cut score, we're going to say they're okay. They can go ahead and take credit level courses. But if they're not, then we worry about them. And there's some kind of treatment, which often means go take a developmental course. These days, more and more, you're required to take a co-requisite course, something like that. And so, right, that's the dynamic. You're below the score, you're not ready. If you're above the score, you are ready. The problem is that we're trying to draw this line at a place where it makes sense. If you put the line too far to the high side, you're going to relegate far more students into having to take developmental courses. Basically, a larger fraction of the students walking in your door, you're going to call them not ready, and they're going to have to do something about it. But if you put it too low, then you're going to say more students are perfectly fine. They're ready to go, send them into their credit-bearing courses. And what we know is that an awful lot of them are not as ready as they should be. They probably do need some additional supports, and they're more likely to fail and then leave. So what I often say here is like, okay, so do I have the answer, right? Like, is there an obvious place where this line should be drawn? And the answer is no. There actually isn't a place to draw this line. Trying to do this is basically impossible. And And you can understand that by charting this a different way. So instead of showing the number of students on the y-axis, we can instead chart our confidence in the results of the test. So again, we still have score on the x-axis. If somebody does really, really badly on a placement test, they probably don't know the material very well. And so you can be confident that that's a student that needs help. If somebody does really, really well, sort of aces the test, if you will, it's hard to do if you didn't actually know the material. And so again, you could be fairly confident that a student actually is probably reasonably prepared. The problem, as you saw from the other chart, is that almost everybody is in neither of those places. They're somewhere in the middle. And there's really very little you can say about whether a student is prepared or is not prepared if they fall anywhere in this zone. Like drawing a line on the left, further to one side or the other is meaningless because it's almost totally arbitrary. All of this suggests that the entire model is flawed. Like we shouldn't be doing placement testing the way we do it. And instead, we really need to think about it differently. And so how do we do that with something like EdReady? Well, there's a role for technology here, which is that EdReady certainly has an assessment component, right? There's a diagnostic phase where we try to understand relative strengths and weaknesses. You can think of it almost like an interim kind of placement exam, except that's not where we stop. That's simply the first phase of what then becomes building out a study path that is specific to that student and that allows the student to actually get all the skills that they need. So there's a shift here from simply binning and sorting to getting every student ready. And that's super important because it doesn't matter if they're a strong student, a middling student, or a weak student. We want them all to be as ready as possible. And so doing this kind of approach says, oh, we're not worrying about the testing aspect of this. All we want to see is your mastery of the concepts that we know are going to predicate your success in your college courses. So the shift, not placement, readiness. It's not a high stakes exam. It gives students and supporting faculty and staff the information they need to make informed decisions. The other thing that's really nice about this is that instead of being kind of a shock or a surprise, or basically another way we're moving students around without their full understanding, EdReady gives you the opportunity to now actually work with students and get the students to take some agency and responsibility for where they are. If a student is weak, students generally know that. And the program kind of says, yeah, you need to spend some time. That's okay. If you put in the time, you're going to get there. Even students who are strong are like, oh, okay, great. I feel good that I know more or I know enough, but right, I could do even better. Having this sort of information, seeing how students grapple with the material rather than just sort of reacting to a few questions, gives you a lot more data. And you can now focus strategic interventions in a much more nimble and effective way. It's a great boon for institutions that are trying to figure out how to allocate scarce resources in the most effective manner possible. And basically, again, right, data to inform practice. You'll be able to learn, right, sort of rinse and repeat in a very OER-like way. You think about, okay, what is this showing us? Is it telling us everything we want? Do we want to maybe tune the model a little bit? You can update it and try it again. And that opportunity for continuous improvement is an inherent byproduct of using a data-rich approach. And so, the sort of short version here is, instead of sitting here worrying about how do we design a cut score so that we can figure out who's in and who's out and that kind of thing, our job really needs to be, we want everybody to be in. That's our job. That's what we're supposed to be doing. Get everybody ready, and we completely change the entire sort of logic of what we're trying to achieve. And so, I'd leave you to this. We believe that no student is remedial, just as no student is perfectly prepared. Every student benefits from personalized support. Right in the heart of that model is the deployment, again, of our resources, open resources from ourselves and other providers, as key components of making sure that students have what they need in order to gain the mastery we expect for their future success. I am going to pause again because I think, are we at the Q&A time? This is a question for David.
We are, Dr. B.
Okay, that's what I thought. So I'm going to just stop there and then see if there are questions. I can obviously dig into things, or if there's any comments or people just want to share their own reflections. And I believe you all have the ability to unmute. So if you would like to do that, you should feel free to do so.
If anyone has questions, please feel free to come on camera. I guess I can start off with a question, Dr. B.
Sure.
Is the impact of the program maximized when the student's institution has a formal partnership with you, or can they access the platform independent of a formal partnership?
So for sure, I would say it would be maximized by having a formal partnership. So we have what we call our public EdReady, which is just edready.org. And anybody in the world can go and create an account there. But that is as a user, right? As a student. So a teacher could tell all of the students in a class, for example, to go to edready.org, create an account, and then use it. And they can use it ubiquitously, right? There's nothing that's held back. But that teacher has no authority to view those student data. So the students either have to share it directly, right? They can export the data at any time. They can take screen grabs, whatever. But basically, that's the only method, right? The student owns his or her data, and we don't know anything about that teacher, right? We have no authority for granting that teacher access to the information. If you become a partner, we actually set up a separate EdReady. So every of our partner institutions gets their own EdReady instance, and we kind of hand them the keys. So it's like, here, this is now your EdReady. As long as all of your students are using this version of EdReady, then you can decide who gets to look at progress data for what students. You can organize it into classes or cohorts or what have you, and you can customize to a far greater degree what you're asking the students to learn. So yeah, it's a pretty big difference in terms of institutional access to the information and the ability to customize the experience in an appropriate way.
Anyone else? Because I have another question if no one else has any. I think what you said about organizational sustainability was really interesting regarding revenue. And I was wondering if you had any insight for organizations in the space who rely entirely on grants and donations. And what insight can you offer regarding building a revenue model, and not necessarily like a membership-based model, but other alternatives that you think make sense in this space?
Yeah, well, so I would say some of the things that at this point I would say have proven to not really work very well are, for example, trying to sustain your entire enterprise on ancillaries. That's been tried a number of times and it doesn't work very well. That can be part of your revenue portfolio, but it's hard to get everything to get paid for just on the back of, oh, you have to pay for the flashcards, right? Or you have to pay for, whatever. So instead, the things that seem to be working are, one, have some kind of a technical platform that deals in information that can't be shared, at least not by default. That's effectively where we went. That's also largely where places like OpenStax and Lumen Learning and others have gone as well, where the majority of what they're doing now involves the routine capture, storage, and then redisplay of student data. And that requires care, that requires access, right? We can't just sort of publish that. And so that becomes a basis for institutions understanding that has value and they'll pay. In the case of places like Lumen and others, they also have done a pretty good job sustaining their work on the back of services. So, step in, provide professional development, like actually hold the hands of faculty working groups to develop OER. And people understand that's valuable, right? I mean, it's fine. You can always go in and monkey around and try to figure it out on your own, but having an expert who can work directly with you, get you to the end results you want, make sure that what you're doing is really thoughtful about how to incorporate in pedagogical practice. Like those are all things that are worth a lot and can certainly be the basis for a business. Our own story, and we're still kind of playing this out, is in an ideal world, you would end up with an operating kernel, right? An operating structure that you're able to sustain without grants. So, that's, and I actually see that not just as, oh, isn't that a nice thing, but it's also an assurance that you can give to the users of your resources that you're not just going to vanish, which is often critical, right? I mean, if you're going to reinvest, if you're going to organize an institution around a new process, for example, a new placement process, or around the use of resources for the longer term, it's a risk if you feel like the organization is just a grant funded project that when the grant funding runs out, poof, it's gone, right? And now there's no more support. Nobody's really maintaining anything, et cetera. So I think it is really critical that the organizations involved show that they have that kernel of sustainability so that these things will persist. And then the grants really should be used for new things, right? That's what allows you to develop new ideas. That's what allows you to, for example, grab hold of what's going on in AI and try to figure out what that means in terms of your work and your partners and so on. Anyhow, that's the model we're pursuing. And I think I see a lot of overlap with a number of the other organizations that are still going strong in the space.
Thank you for that. I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has one. No? Last call for questions before we wrap up?
Yeah, I would just say, I could just say one more thing in lieu of a question that I mentioned earlier. I said earlier that we really see scale as an equity play. We had a talk at the League for Innovation in the Community College earlier this year. And what we mean by that is that far too many of sort of the innovations that we promote in the world, and I would say this is rife in the world of OER, we see them as kind of experiments. Like it ends up being the work of a particularly enterprising teacher or an institution that's really decided to move forward with that idea or what have you. That's great. A lot of great things get worked out that way. But if you know something works and students are going to benefit, it's a problem when that thing is only available to a small subset of the student population, right? Like we need to find a way to get that stuff out to everybody. Otherwise, it's inequitable. And it's kind of a weird spin on where scale matters. Scale obviously matters to us as well because it helps improve, the bottom line and so on. But our primary emphasis is we know that this makes a difference. How do we get it to everybody? How do we get it to everybody? And that is one of the core premises around OER as well. I would just ask everybody to think a little harder about that. That's it.
Great. Well, thank you so much for a very informative presentation. I learned a lot about OER that I didn't know, and also about your work. So we appreciate everything that you're doing, Dr. B. And to everyone else, thank you for joining in. This is the first of several webinars that we're hosting this summer on OER and AI. So please stay tuned for invites to the next meeting. And again, thank you from our headquarters here in Atlanta, Georgia. We appreciate you. And if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me or my colleague, Allison. And again, thank you. Have a great rest of the day. And we appreciate you, Dr. B. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, and hope everyone has a great day.